So this is video 2 of the structural frame analysis of Vasily Kandinsky's Yellow, Red and Blue from 1925. So in the last video we looked at the first half of the questions here. We're just going to leave that one out for now. It's not so relevant for this work. So we're up to the compositional devices of the work. I mean, I've done this video a little bit differently. So instead of me typing along, which takes more time, I figured I'd just do it beforehand and then go over, and then you can glean from that the most important aspects as you see fit. So compositional devices, we're looking at things like focal point direction, balance within the work, so repetition and rhythm, and some kind of contrast in terms of both colours and shape as well. So focal point, I've said here, typical of abstraction works, there is not one particular focal point. There's a number here. You could say it's the circle, you could say it's the eye, you could say it's this large form here. And that loss of perspective is really typical of abstract artworks. There is that loss of perspective, that loss of depth, that loss of kind of recognizable reality in a sense. So direction, I've said here, the eye is led around the work in a kind of circular fashion, but it also does kind of spiral into the middle, and this follows the direction of lines, it follows the direction of shape, but there's a recognizably circular kind of direction in this work, coupled with both that kind of spirally, more confused and jumbled kind of direction within the middle of the work. So balance, in terms of symmetry, the work I think is broken really almost distinctively into two halves. So there's this, left and right side. So on the left side here, I've said, it's much more rigid, it's much more geometric. There's thick lines that kind of outline certain sections. There's much more use of controlled line here. With the right-hand side, it's much more natural and free-flowing. We see a lot more kind of circular shapes. The shapes here, do overlap, but there's no rigid black outline as we see on the left-hand side here. So all in all, it's much more kind of rigid and then free-flowing. And then we'll talk about that later when we start to unpack what that could mean. But it's almost like there's the human and then the musical side. So in terms of repetition and rhythm, said while some shapes have been repeated, such as the curved lines and circles, the work is more sporadic, so it's more random, a bit more kind of, just pops up every now here and there rather than a repetitive aspect to it. So the rhythm in this work is created through kind of curved lines that are then punctuated by solid shapes. So, we've got curved lines here, and then it's interrupted by these solid lines. Wavy forms, interrupted by geometric rigid forms, and faded and shaded colour, which is cut off abruptly by solid blocks. So there is really that kind of, and we get into that more here with the contrast as well. And contrast here really occurs between rigid geometric forms and natural forms. So that's the main use of contrast. But as too is the use of bold outlines contrasted against more natural and open shapes. So, bold outlines here, we've got that much more natural, overlapping, kind of free-flowing forms and shapes. So what symbols and signs in the work? So this is where we kind of have to use our background knowledge of Kandinsky. So we know he had synesthesia. We know that music was an incredibly important influence to him. It was, a preoccupation of his for his entire life, even when he pursued other careers in law, etc. But we can kind of read into this with some of the, knowing that he did have this kind of crossover, this sensory crossover between sights and sounds, and his preoccupation with music. So I've said here, there are some signs and symbols in the work that we can recognise and interpret given what we know about Kandinsky. And this is why it's important also to know about the context of the artists. I mean, if you didn't know anything about him, you might just say, oh, he likes shapes. But we know more than that. So I said the figure on the left is reminiscent of a human face with a triangular nose, curved crown of the head, and the solid block where the ear would be. So we can kind of see that recognizable human form to some extent here. It's obviously been abstracted quite a bit, but I think we can all recognize that there's, the eye there as well. The cross-hatched and parallel lines and the dots down the bottom here are reminiscent of musical symbols. So things like a bass and a treble clef, so that looks very much like a bass clef there. That looks like a really kind of disassembled or disjointed treble clef with the dots there. And the musical staff, or the lines that music is printed on. We can see kind of references to that here and here as well. Also, the colourful area on the right-hand side seems to be coming from or going towards the ear. And as we know, Kandisnky had synesthesia, particularly with music. We can infer that the form could be representative of music if it's being represented physically. The curved flowing areas that have been abruptly punctuated by rigid shapes could represent the flowing sections of music, and then the underpinned by the bass and percussion that keeps it in time. So we've got the more free flowing improvised sections, but there is that rhythmic solid kind of representation there, which could mimic the the beat that keeps music in time. So finally, what does the visual language of the artwork communicate? So I think, given what we know about Kandisnky, and through all the signs and symbols present in the work, we can probably infer pretty accurately that this work was inspired by music, and it's a representation of humans interacting with music or experiencing music in some way. So I've said here, the visual language of this work communicates how the artist was often lost in music, taken over literally and spiritually by the colours that he visually associated with the sound. There are references to musical symbols, as we've discussed, in the bottom right-hand side of the work, and there is a recognisable human form interacting with or receiving the musical form. The contrast of rigid and flowing forms contained in the work references the ebbs and flows of musical composition, the colours relating to the notes and the rhythm of music. So we can kind of see it's a very rhythmical work, but what we know about Kandisnky is important here. So we know that he was very preoccupied with music. A lot of his works, especially later on, around this time, 1925, were very much influenced by music and his love of abstraction as well. And we can see a lot of references to both of those things in there. So look, I think that's a pretty detailed analysis of this work from a structural frame perspective. So I'll let you fill out this document with the information from these videos. What I would like you to do down the bottom here is just write a descriptive paragraph. Oh, that's a pretty bad way to phrase that. Write a paragraph describes the physical, symbolic, qualities of the work. And this is good practice for when you're writing an essay. So when you're writing about a work, it's always good to give a description from a structural frame perspective so that you can then go back and kind of extrapolate meaning or point to sections of the work to justify why you think it means something. So, I would start this off with like just using all the information that we've kind of got from the work. I don't want you to describe absolutely every aspect of the work because that's going to take you a long time, but just the important points. So what techniques have been used, what kind of compositional devices, like summarize it into a brief sentence or two. And then finally, at the end of that, just write a little bit about what the visual language infers. What could this work begin? How could we begin to understand the kind of conceptual underpinnings of the work or what the work's about? So that's just a little activity at the end, just one paragraph, include a summary of this structural frame analysis into a very succinct and well-structured paragraph.